again for another edition of New Maroon Getaway vlog. It's been a while since I've done one of these, and quite a bit has happened since the last vlog. It's now June of 2020, so we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic. So that has had everybody's attention for quite some time. And recently there has been, as many of you are well aware, there's been a series of protests and demonstrations and riots, rebellions, uprisings, however one would characterize what they're seeing, surrounding the killing of an unarmed black man in America by law enforcement. So there's been quite a lot of activity in response to that event. So, you know, it's interesting to be talking about this this human predators, human prey, society as ecosystem and atomic collapse, being able to reference those events or those happenings against the backdrop of what's being covered in the essay. So this is probably as good a time as any to finish and to actually go through the summary of the essay, which is in fact the last part, the last section of the third part of the essay. So that's what we're going to be covering in this edition. So this is covering, this is section 8 of part 3 of Richard Heinberg's Society as Ecosystem in a Time of Collapse. Again, the title is Human Predators, Human Prey. The subtitle, Society as Ecosystem in a Time of Collapse. Section 8 is titled as follows. Summary: the usefulness and limits of the predator-prey metaphor. Is the predator-prey frame helpful? What have we learned that's relevant to our present global milieu? Both conflict and integrationist explanations for the evolution of societal complexity could be said to be applicable, though each seems a better fit for certain times, places, and practices. In describing raiding, conquest, colonialism, and slavery, conflict, or predator-prey theory, fits the facts well and offers insights. In the case of a modern industrial state with welfare programs and universal health care, it is easy to argue that everyone benefits by cooperating to enable the creation and maintenance of such a wealthy and formidable society, even if some benefit more than others. However, that benefit is contingent on the society's ability to sustain itself in the long term. If it is operating in a way that undermines its own ecological foundations, all will eventually suffer. This could certainly be said to be the case with the emergence of, again, the COVID-19 pandemic, because this has actually been tied to the destruction of natural habitat. Most of the viruses that we've seen emerged in recent years, whether it be MERS or SARS or Ebola or even fairly common viral illnesses, malaria, you know, things that are often ascribed to insects as being vectors. Those are also symptomatic of the destruction of natural habitat, which would increase the contact that people have with animals, especially in the case that they are eating them or consuming them. And this has certainly been the case of one of the things that's been tied to the emergence of COVID-19. So again, keep that in mind. The contradiction between conflict and integration theories is somewhat resolved in the domestication metaphor, quote unquote. Most members of society benefit to some degree from the cooperation between predator, quote unquote, and prey, quote unquote, implied in the process of human-on-human domestication, though this could hardly be argued to be the case for slavery and its aftermath, which may continue for generations. Again, in referring to what we see happening with the events surrounding the George Floyd protests, and then some of the previous events that have emerged with other, again, unarmed, Black Americans have been killed at the hands of law enforcement. We've also, again, seen these periodic upheavals or this periodic unrest. This is indeed tied to this aftermath that comes out of the mindset that actually gave birth to the whole system of chattel slavery, the sort of dehumanization or the devaluing of those who were seen as being fit to be made slaves, and really the inability, seemingly, evidently, the inability to be able to extend to those people the same sort of rights and protections and benefit of the doubt that other citizens in America are afforded. So this is, again, very appropriate given the, given what we have happening now. But whatever mutual benefit accrues is subject to negotiation, and also to the phases of the adaptive cycle, which, again, we've talked about the adaptive cycle in the previous episodes. In adopting the predator-prey frame, I have leaned toward an interpretation of human history that is conflict-based, even though complex society is inherently a cooperative structure. Perhaps the integrationist view is more useful in understanding the growth phase of the societal adaptive cycle. As the release phase approaches, the social contract may fail, and the predator-prey relations may become more naked and severe. If and when this happens, conflict theory may be more applicable and revelatory. However, in finding our path through the release phase and toward a phase of reorganization, it may be essential to find ways to cooperate that minimize or exclude predation. In other words, you may actually have an enlightened self-interest in no longer seeing it as being advantageous for you to take advantage of or exploit other people for your own benefit, because that will ultimately end up spelling your own end at some point, or again, endangering yourself in doing so. Perhaps seeing the class and power dynamics of society through the lens of predation can highlight the machinery of inequality and exploitation, helping us avoid being preyed upon, quote unquote, and preying upon others, and inspiring us to help loosen the bonds of domestication that harness our fellow citizens. Yet we may also become inspired to think about ways of building forms of social complexity that do not depend upon warfare and predation. Perhaps this course of cultural evolution would constitute the metaphoric equivalent of becoming a species of primary consumers. The example that he's pointing to here is vegetarians. This opens up a whole other, again, can of worms, because the debates between about the merits of different types of diets that's a very touchy subject with a lot of people, because obviously people very much, they identify with very strongly with the adoption of again, different food systems and ways of feeding yourself, and what that indicates about you in terms of your ethics or your what kind of person you are. It's a very touchy subject. Though I personally have maintained a vegetarian diet for several decades, I harbor no illusion that the rest of humanity is likely to adopt a similar lifestyle anytime soon, although doing so would dramatically reduce our impact upon climate and land use. Again, this is depending on the way in which this vegetarian food that he's referring to is produced, the manner in which it's actually provisioned, it does not necessarily mean that in every case that this is actually the this would be the best option for people. If we talk about food that is produced locally, even if that includes the production of meat, or if people hunt, and it's done in a way that does not, again, negatively impact the local ecological health of a place, really ultimately that should be the measure. I think we have to remember that most land degradation that has occurred historically has been by means of agriculture. We'd also have to examine whether or not we're talking about systems of food production that are based on annual crops. Are they based on perennial crops? How is this cropping done? How is this actually performed? So this is not. It's a bit more complex than I think than many may appreciate. Nevertheless, both metaphoric and literal vegetarianism can be pursued in degrees. As I've stressed in this essay, even in complex and stratified societies, levels of inequality in power and wealth are highly variable. The pursuit of more cooperative and less exploitative social structures can take many forms. Experiments with innovative democratic institutions, ways of increasing voter participation, direct representation, ranked choice voting, etc., recommoning, bioregionalism, and more. Another potential benefit from the framing employed in this essay is the possibility of increasing awareness of the nature of our collective current global predicament. As we have seen, human on human and human on nature predation are ultimately self-limiting, and there is evidence to suggest that we are reaching certain limits. We appear to be on the cusp of seismic shifts in the global ecosystem and in human, financial, social, and political systems. This means we are also at a time when new thinking and ways of doing things are required and may have a chance of overturning well-established norms. As Peter Turchin documents in Ultra Society, we humans are already on a track toward higher levels of social complexity and less interpersonal violence prior to the fossil fuel industrial age. As the carbon-fed growth bubble pops, there is the prospect for a great unraveling, accompanied by a significant rise in violence, at least in the short term. But there is also the possibility that the longer-term trend Turchin points to will eventually assert itself, perhaps discovering how cooperation and complexity are possible without social predation will constitute our next evolutionary project.